the EA community, go to EA events. To me, they don't feel good. To me, they don't feel like wholesome places. There's a lack of, I think, emotional attunement oftentimes.
Okay, well, I think I'm guilty of low emotional attunement. So let's say I became really emotionally attuned like you. Then as a result, where would I donate my charity budget?
Uh,
Welcome to Doom Debates. So I was on Twitter a couple weeks ago, and there was a big debate about effective altruism stoked by Mark Andreessen and a bunch of people in the tech community. And I reached out publicly to all my followers and I said, anybody who wants to come debate me on effective altruism, I will defend it and let's have this argument. So today I've got a volunteer. His name is Jonas Sota. He's been living in the San Francisco Bay Area for most of his life. He's been in the software industry. He's currently a software engineer at Rippling. He studied philosophy at UCLA. And he's been a longtime observer of effective altruism, and he's not a fan. So he is my volunteer to come debate me against EA. Welcome to the show, Jonas.
Thanks for having me, Laurent.
All right, so let's give your opening statement. Like, what is your beef with effective altruism?
My understanding of effective altruism is that it is about maximizing impact, which is an idea that I actually grew up in Berkeley. Starting in preschool, they were telling us we can have all this impact and we should have all this impact in the world. And going through adulthood, I've noticed that people I grew up with, people who grew up in similar circumstances, were going around the world having impact that they felt good about, but was imposing their values and they didn't have skin in the game. So ultimately, I think that EA encourages a lot of people to go to other parts of the world and have impact that's actually harmful or unaligned with other people's values.
Okay. Can you give an example of that?
Yeah. So, I think a relatively well-known example is Tom's Shoes. Right. Their whole shtick was you buy a pair and they'll donate a pair to somebody in the community and, in a disadvantaged place. And they ended up saturating some communities with free pairs of shoes to the point where they put local shoe cobblers out of business. And so instead of, building up a place, helping people become more enabled, they actually, it was a kind of obtuse and in this some way destructive form of charity.
Got it. Okay. So I think we're going to be hitting on a few different points. And this is, I guess, your first point here is the idea that it basically backfires. So the predicted impact differs from the actual impact. That's like a major point you have.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I know you've got a few other points too. So I guess we'll just take them one by one. So let's start with that. And a word I like to use for this kind of argument is like recoil effect, right? So you think that the recoil of trying to fire some shot is so bad that you end up recoiling more than you're firing forward.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that.
Okay. And, I've seen this kind of argument in so many contexts, and I often feel like it's overused. I think you're overusing it right now, but it's, that's for me to prove. But in general, when I think people are overusing it, I made up this term. I call it recoil exaggeration. I feel like it's a common bias, and I haven't actually made an argument why you're doing it. But I do think that in the wild, i.e. on Twitter, I just see so many cases of recoil exaggeration. For example, like people say, it would be great to extend life. And then somebody's like, no way, extending life would lead to overpopulation. And I'm like, okay, yeah, overpopulation might have some bad recoil effects, but it's certainly an exaggeration to say that is so bad that it makes extending life bad. Like extending life is still good on net. Like the recoil doesn't fully cancel out the forward effect. So I suspect that you're currently committing recoil exaggeration, and I'm going to try to argue why, okay?
Sure.
Now, first of all, I will agree with you that some charities screw it up, right? I definitely know some charities screw it up. Like I think the case of Play Pumps International that was covered in Will McCaskill's first book, Doing Good Better. I think they really shit the bed with Play Pumps International. They like install like these playground carousels that were also water pumps, and they were like totally wasteful, like way worse than regular pumps, just like screwed up the landscape. Like the kids didn't even use it. It was like a bad carousel. So like I agree that once in a while you have these efforts that are net negative. And I think that was one of them. So I'll concede that. I think the whole point of effective altruism, though, is to do some basic calculations. Like that was given as an example of altruism that's not effective. So I agree with you that you can have misguided altruists. But when we're talking about effective altruism, aren't we actually just talking about ways to knowably avoid doing that? Or is your claim that it never works?
Oh, I wouldn't say it never works. I think another good example that it seems to me like the potential for a negative impact is quite benign is like donating mosquito nets to malaria-ridden parts of the developing world. Like I don't see. I would be very surprised if somebody made a coherent argument that that was somehow doing harm.
You're basically saying, yeah, nobody could criticize malaria nets, but actually, funny enough, one of the reasons that sparked this conversation is that Mark Andreessen was on Twitter tweeting a quote-unquote study that was like, malaria nets are actually bad. They use it for fishing. They don't use it for malaria.
Oh, interesting.
A bunch of effective altruists were like, that paper is like not credible. We had this discussion like 10 years ago. Malaria nets totally do help. The recoil effect is tiny. So basically, Mark Andreessen's going off half-cocked, trying to basically character assassinate effective altruism by using an example which is super weak, when from my perspective, the reality of the situation is here's a bunch of altruistic people, effectively altruistic people, using their money to actually make a bunch of people not get malaria. Like, it seems incredibly valuable. And it's crazy to me that Mark Andreessen is kind of getting away with, in the public discourse, just trashing malaria nets when, you know, just to extend the irony of Mark Andreessen, he's also complaining at the same time about how he can't believe when people are trashing like Mark Zuckerberg's charity to build a hospital, which I agree with, right? I agree with. So just going down this rabbit hole of what a hypocrite Mark Andreessen is, he's like simultaneously in the same week talking about how it's messed up that people can't appreciate when he and Mark Zuckerberg donate to hospitals, and also saying malaria nets are stupid, they don't work, effective altruists are like fake, they don't care about people. Like, basically, I'm not a fan of Mark Andreessen. What were we talking about?
We were talking about the recoil effect, right?
Exactly. So I guess why don't we go back to malaria nets, right? So it sounds like you actually are conceding that malaria nets are good, and to the extent that effective altruists pay money to get malaria nets, then they're doing good. Is that right?
Well, you know, I mean, there's some sort of controversy. I would want to look into it before saying malaria nets are definitely good. But I think it's hard for me to see how like opportunity for that having a detrimental impact. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean,
but
just
that's one
saying
instance, right? There's other instances that are, I think, much worse. That I can point where Western activists are the unintended consequences, and more often than not, they're not even aware of the consequences they're having with their attempts to help other people, are catastrophic sometimes.
It's possible that we disagree on less than we think, because if you agree that the malaria net intervention was good, which it sounds like you do, and if you furthermore agree that we can analyze ahead of time if some intervention looks more like a malaria net intervention than a play pumps intervention, then it sounds like you endorse the project of effective altruism, which says you sit down ahead of time, analyze whether it looks like a good effort, and then if so, do it.
In principle, but what I'm getting at is how you assess the good that you're having might not be aligned with how the people that you're trying to help assess what is good. And there's a very good example that's happening right now that I wouldn't be surprised if many effective altruists would actually disagree with you on the matter.
Okay, and what is that?
I think I wouldn't be surprised if many effective altruists think that it's net positive to donate money and other supplies to Gaza. They want to help civilians in Gaza. They're not aware that those are going to Hamas, and Hamas is using those to gain even more leverage over the people of Gaza.
Okay, so I could take that as a hypothetical criticism of some recoil that could happen. And of course, it's politically charged, right? So there may be some listeners being like, no, aid to Gaza is good. But I think my main objection is just I don't really see Gaza aid as like a major high priority effective altruism area, right? Because generally when you go to like the effective altruism forum, they prioritize the causes and they say, hey, if you want to do something high priority, right now they're talking about like you could have a lot of impact per dollar if you help shrimp welfare. Like there's so much shrimp suffering, and a dollar goes a really long way to make a bunch of shrimps get less tortured, which I actually think makes sense. So if you want to criticize what they're actually talking about, maybe you should criticize the shrimp welfare initiative rather than criticizing Gaza, which is like hundreds down their list if it's there at all.
Perhaps. I think what I'm more so elucidating is a very good example of Western activists who care about helping people, but are having actually the opposite effect that they're trying to have. It also like trying to help like shrimp in, I don't know, Southeast Asia. Right? When you have people literally wasting away in the streets of San Francisco. I mean, that just brings up another criticism. Why are you focusing on shrimp and potentially having all sorts of impact on, the people of Southeast Asia without any skin in the game when you have, very dire problems literally on your doorstep?
I think it's a fair question. So there is a crux of disagreement on shrimp welfare. Like there is a coherent position you can take to argue that the shrimp welfare project is stupid, or even more generally, animal welfare is stupid. Like, would you generalize your argument to be like any kind of animal welfare?
I'm actually, shrimp. I'm some form of vegan mostly for animal welfare purposes.
So you have a moral circle, but it doesn't extend to seafood, or how does that work?
No, it totally does. I just think that, ultimately, I mean, this kind of goes, it goes into my theory on actually how I think Americans and people in the West should lead, which is not by going across the world trying to solve problems, but by serving as a model for the world. And that means clean up your city. San Francisco could be a model to the world of how to form a society, how to run a city. It turns out it's one of the worst running, cities in the developed world. It's in many ways a very unhealthy society, and we have people focusing on shrimp as opposed to right.
Is your argument at all for that we shouldn't prioritize animals over humans, or is it specifically just that we shouldn't prioritize faraway causes over local causes?
It's mostly about let's focus on local causes where we better understand the context and we have skin in the game.
Okay. I mean, in the context of the shrimp welfare charity, do you think that we don't understand the context of shrimp welfare?
I don't think we understand the context of shrimp welfare and how that, impacts the livelihoods and economy of the local people. And it's something that people in San Francisco can totally screw up and get, not pay any consequences for it.
So I'm not an expert on shrimp welfare. I was just reading about it today from my friend Bentham's Bulldog on his blog. That's one of his causes. I don't think the context is that hard to understand. It's something like you have these shrimp farms, and when they want to kill the shrimp, they do it in like a very painful torture way. And if we're lucky, maybe the shrimp have like no consciousness, maybe they have no feelings of pain. But unfortunately, they do have like a nervous system, and they do show some pain reactions. Like they show a willingness to kind of move away from pain. And even if there's like a positive source, like they won't go towards something if they feel pain. Like there's ways to measure whether there's some pain response, and there's like an ambiguous result. Like there may be a pain response. And if there is a pain response, we're certainly doing a lot to trigger it because we subject them to like brutal temperatures while they're still alive. So the argument goes something like, if you think that a shrimp is getting at least a few % of the amount of torture that you could have as a human, so if you empathize with the shrimp at all, even in theory, you might want to steer clear of doing like these brutal mechanisms of killing them. And the other part of the argument is that it's very cheap. So like for just a few bucks, you can save, I don't even know, like thousands of shrimps, like you give them better conditions. And then to your point about understanding the context, I think we understand enough where it's like, hey, you're farming them using this way. We can pay you to just farm them slightly differently in a
Yeah.
way that if they feel anything at all, they'll feel much better. And it's like very,
Uh-huh.
very cheap. There's like huge
Mhm.
economies of scale with shrimp welfare where like a few bucks. If you try to multiply out some numbers, like this is kind of like the core of effective altruism, where it's like, look, you can help like 1,000,000 shrimp as easily as you could help one human. So if you think that the factor of shrimp versus human suffering is anywhere near, it's anywhere better than 1 in 1,000,000, like a shrimp suffers, 1,000th as much as a human, you should consider helping out the shrimp a little bit. Like that's how the argument goes. I don't think that it's a knockdown argument. I think you could have somebody who's just like, I don't think shrimp are moral patients at all. I think that's a coherent position. But like, what is your beef? Is that your beef?
I think, one, I would have to really understand the more about the solution and, like what kind of pressure is being put on the farmers and what are the potential for negative externality. There's a lot of details that matter here, so I don't want to opine on that. There's also like, we're coming up to questions like fundamental disagreements with the EA ideology, as well as like disagreements like in practice. I think the question here is what comes up for me is, would you prioritize 1 billion shrimps, 10 billion shrimps over your own child?
Yeah, I think most effective altruism proponents wouldn't, right? Like I wouldn't, right? I haven't donated anything to the Shrimp Welfare Project myself. I do buy the argument that it's deserving of some money, right? It's just not, it just hasn't moved me to go all the way to donating my money to it. But like, I think it's great that some people are like researching how much we should care, and some people have decided that they do care. And like, I care a little bit. Like, I think they're going in the right direction. But like, to your question of like, would I sacrifice my child for all the shrimp in the world? No, I personally wouldn't. And I don't think that effective altruism tells you to do that to your child. I think what effective altruism tells you to do is, to the extent that you just want to be altruistic, not just to your own family, just to somebody, you just want to help somebody who you don't know. Well, here is some analysis you can do to decide who to help and like actually help them more than you otherwise would.
I think there's just much more pressing problems. Like, for example, if you ask any woman, and I do this all the time, ask any woman in San Francisco, do you feel safe walking alone on the streets at night? Or just walking alone on the streets in general? They, 100% of them have told me no.
Yeah, so look, I think it's great to help San Francisco, right? Like I'm not against doing that. So what do you think effective altruism is telling you differently here?
It's convincing people to focus on shrimp on the other side of the world, as opposed to problems that are impacting their friends and their family members and their colleagues and the people they share a city with, the people that they're creating a society with. And like I said before, we would have a bigger impact if, people don't realize outside of the U.S. That a lot of people outside of the U.S. No longer look to the U.S. as a model for how to create a good society. If we did that, then I think more people in the other parts of the world would start thinking about these considerations of, how are we treating shrimp? How are we treating the cows and chickens and pigs that we're raising for slaughter? Okay. If they saw us as a model. But they don't see us as a model, because they literally see on the news. It's global news, the situation in San Francisco with like homelessness, for example.
Well, let me just make sure I understand your argument. Which of these do you think will help more shrimp not get tortured? Cleaning up San Francisco, or donating to help shrimp not get tortured?
Long term, I think making San Francisco a place worth modeling your society after will have a much bigger impact. It'll extend far, far beyond shrimp. It'll help people change their consciousness to where they're thinking about these questions themselves.
Okay. So like if I have like $1,000 that I want to donate this year to some strangers, like my family is already well fed, nobody's dying, I just want to donate $1,000, and I see that I could literally help like a huge fraction of the world's shrimp suffer less if I use that $1,000. Or I could donate $1,000 to a charity in SF that helps, let's say, lobby the government, right? Or you can choose your favorite SF charity. But like that $1,000, I think it just comes down to a question of like, how far is it going to go? I think that's the key variable here, because if the $1,000 turns San Francisco into like this clean city with like no drugs on the street, right? If that only costs $1,000, I'd be like, ooh, that does sound tempting compared to the shrimp. I gotta agree. But if the $1,000 just goes into a pit, right, and like helps one homeless person a little bit for a week compared to saving all the shrimp, like, don't you think at some point the $1,000 is better spent on the shrimp?
I will give it to you that, I mean, giving $1,000 to a charity or to any initiative trying to improve San Francisco is unlikely to do much at all. I don't, right? And so it's certainly easier to at least feel that you're doing something by giving $1,000 to the shrimp. I don't think that the situation, San Francisco has enough money. The problem is not money. San Francisco is saturated with money.
Okay.
It's
So when we
it's
talk about
a
effective
social, it's
altruism,
a social problem, right? It's not something you can just throw
yeah.
money. We're already throwing what, $80,000-$90,000 per year, a year per homeless person. So it's not a matter of money,
Okay. So
which
when
is
we talk
harder.
about which is what?
It's harder, right? It's like, if you want to have an impact, it requires much more involvement, engagement, reorienting your life, than just donating some money.
Right. So it's tempting to throw around like ideologies and be like, look, it's better if the world is more capitalistic. Let's focus on capitalism. And so the question is really what's being traded off here? Like, what decisions are we actually making when we have a conversation like this? For me, I have a recurring donation to give directly. So I take some of my money, and every month some of it just goes to random people in Africa. I don't even know where they're sending it these days. It's just to people who need some money because they live on
Mhm.
like $2 a day. And
Uh-huh.
then maybe they get like $50 from me, and then they can like buy themselves like a better roof. So then they're not like dealing with roof problems all day. So then maybe they have more bandwidth to like work on their business or healthcare, whatever. Like $50 when you're making $2 a day, it buys you some breathing space, right? So when you talk about like, hey, it would be great to fix San Francisco, it would be great to be a model to the world. Like that's all great, but I also have to just direct my donation budget somewhere, right? I think that's where effective altruism really shines, is just in helping. There's like a $1 trillion donation industry, right? People want to donate. People have always been altruistic
Well,
when they can. So that's the trade-off that's being made, is just where should people direct their donations?
I'm not. I mean, I agree with you, and I mentioned that just shortly ago. It's much. EA is making it easy to feel that you're doing something, and maybe you are doing something. Although I think it's
Well, yeah,
notable that you don't
I think it's
actually know where your money is going. You
okay.
don't
I think
know
it's
what these
unfair
people
that
are doing with it.
you're bringing up this concept of making it easy to feel that you're doing something. That's not what I'm arguing for, right? So why
I know,
even
but like,
bring?
you don't know
Yeah.
what you're actually doing in Africa. You don't know what the impact of your money going to Africa is. You don't even know if it's actually going to people.
What if you had a friend who you trust to analyze things properly, and the friend did all the steps
Yeah.
that one would
Yeah.
do to
And I
analyze the
appreciate and
situation?
I
So the
and I
friend would
appreciate
audit the
that EU
charity.
does this. I agree. I agree. And I think
Okay.
EA has done much, and has done. I appreciate that they have. It There's a culture of really scrutinizing this stuff. I appreciate that. And quantifying as best you
Okay.
can impact, and making systems more efficient, and bringing a lot of sort of good lessons learned from the technology industry into those kind of things. That's
Yeah,
not
and if you
the
want to
beef I
audit, the
have.
more you can, right? Like I'm sure you could get on a plane and go visit some of these give directly recipients, or you can like correspond with them over email. Like I don't think they try to hide, auditing the stuff.
I I wouldn't say tell people. I wouldn't tell you to stop doing that, to stop giving that money. But what calls to my attention is, I don't think I was gonna say I don't think it's enough. I feel like I don't want to. It's perhaps unfair. That's not the disposition I want to have. Uh, but I would, for example, if you vote for uh, political candidates that that go against the United States, that are countering the ability of this country to serve as a model for the world. I think you're negating what you're doing. I think you're negating your donations. Like, sure, there's, you can alleviate some short-term suffering, but long-term, like what's the long-term plan? You're going to fix the world by just throwing money at problems? Is that enough?
I think that, yeah, it's a good question, right? Because I think one of the strongest points that people tend to make when they're not a fan of EA is they're like, look, one of the biggest charities in the world is Amazon, right? Like they've improved the quality of life so much, and they've been a for-profit company. They've made a lot of money for shareholders and for their executives, but they've also, the consumer surplus that they've created has actually exceeded the amount that they've taken for the shareholders. Jeff Bezos even made this point in his last shareholder letter before he stepped down as CEO of Amazon. He's saying, look, the value that Amazon's created is just mostly getting captured by the people who use Amazon, you and me. And that's probably, I don't think Jeff Bezos put it in these terms, but that's more value than potentially any charity that's ever existed, just that amount of consumer surplus. And similarly, like Google search, right? The fact that anybody, no matter how poor, can go to an internet cafe and do a free Google search. Well, that's a lot of consumer surplus, right? That's kind of like a charity, even though Google is extremely profitable. So there is definitely an argument to be made, being like, look, it's all about capitalism. It's all about growing GDP and, yeah, letting people profit, but just like the more capitalism, the better. And so anytime that you're focusing on making a donation of a malaria bed net, you're distracting yourself from capitalism, so you're wasting your time. What do you think about that argument?
No, I'm not entirely sold on that, because I think there's some, we can all think of examples where capitalism doesn't serve certain needs.
Okay. Oh, and my counter argument to that is like, first of all, I actually agree with a big chunk. Like I do think that like on a decades long time scale, capitalism probably is a bigger force of good compared to anything. Like all the charity that's ever been done in the last 100 years probably is less than the impact on, in fact, I'm almost sure, right? I mean, if you imagine we go back to the year 1600 and we ramp up the charity, we do a ton of charity and we do very little capitalism, then we get screwed. It becomes the year 2025 and we don't have computers, we don't have internet, right? We just have like, more equal
Sure.
distribution of like crappy food, right? Of like rotting vegetables that aren't refrigerated. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea of like capitalism is like the biggest force for good. It's why we have nice things. It's just, here's the thing. We live in capitalism. We have a lot of rich people. Like if you're on YouTube listening to this conversation, you're probably relatively rich compared to people in the world. And we have some money that we could donate. And you can't really like donate to capitalism with your extra profit. And there are people today who are about to get malaria. Like, do you really want to let them get malaria when you've already done your part in capitalism and they just need a net and the net is really cheap? And if that's not convincing, like, just imagine it was your friend's friend. Are you really going to tell your friend's friend, nope, go F yourself, I'm donating to capitalism, I'm purchasing a share of NVIDIA, I'm doing my part more than getting the net you need to not get bitten by a mosquito? It's like, hold on a second. I think we should take some of our money that we have extra and do really effective interventions today.
I don't disagree with that. I don't trust the assessment of most Western activists or most Westerners in general. People from the West have a very long track record of trying to help people and screwing them. Imposing Western
Right.
values in a place where Western values don't work, and that they are at odds. And it's very much tied to this belief that Western progressive values are the most enlightened and universally correct values. And
Yeah,
I think if you went around EA, I think you would find a preponderance of that attitude towards the world.
it's often hard for me to tell whether you're arguing for miscellaneous bad things that Westerners have done compared to bad things that EA are doing. And you're claiming that real EAs are doing bad things, but like, can you be specific? And is there something that I could pull up on EA's website, or is it like a secret thing that EAs do? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I regret not looking up more projects here. Fortunately, I don't have time. My criticism is more so like, I think fundamentally the motivation of EA coupled with the worldview of EA is just bound to be part of this pattern. I mean, EA is in part is an ideology, and in part's a tool, and I appreciate many aspects of the tool, but it's the ideology that I don't trust.
Okay. Do you think I have that ideology?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. What ideology do I have?
I don't know. I mean, do you think every country in the world should be a liberal democracy? That's just inherently better for everybody.
I mean, I think that liberal democracies tend to be really good places to live, but I don't want to be like absolutist about it, because if you have a country of people where it seems like everybody has basic rights and they're all really happy with some other form of government, I think that's probably fine.
Okay. Do you think that, I mean, I think something I see in a lot of, assessments made by NGOs is, how many, what percentage of women in a society, have a career. And in some cultures, they heavily value more traditional gender roles where, um, you could even call it a career of homemaking, of family building, of being involved in the community. And a lot of NGOs sort of measure their impact on, well, how many of these women are we transitioning into having a career?
Right, I
Right.
see what you're saying. So that's like imposing a Western value because maybe
Right.
it would just be better to not transition the women into having a career.
And it's one thing to say, like, we want women to have the choice, but
Right.
do like, something that's happened in the United States is a lot of, there's a women should have a career.
Yeah, so
And
by the way, I'm sure some charities value this, but I don't think I've heard of an effective altruism charity that's doing this. Have you?
no, I can't. I don't know the
Okay,
details.
I mean, I think that's an important point, right? I think it's almost like you may have valid points that are applicable to charities in general, right? But remember, the effective altruism movement sprang up because it looked at the set of charities. It's like there's $1 trillion industry of people donating to charity,
Mhm.
and you look at the charities and they're like wasting the money, or they're doing something where it's like they spend so much money and they get a
And very
tiny
little
bit of impact.
impact. Right.
Right. What if we just try to maximize the impact per dollar? And at first it sounds like, it's like, wow, look at these nerds just trying to squeeze some more impact per dollar. Like, don't worry so much about the impact. And I'm sympathetic to that when we're just talking about like, okay, plus 20% impact. Like, why would you hyper optimize the last 20%? But the crazy thing about effective altruism is we noticed that the potential impact increase, it wasn't like plus 20%. It was like plus a factor of 100, right? Like
Sure. Yeah.
it was like
Yeah.
barely, far greater than anything charities had done before. Like, if you don't, like the malaria nets are just like so much cheaper than like helping animal shelters save a few extra puppies. Like buying a ton of cheap malaria nets that actually prevent malaria, because malaria is like really bad and it's like really cheap to prevent. So this is like the driving motivation of effective altruism. And we effective altruists, we do tend to share your frustration with most charities. We're like, most charities are like net bad because they're framing themselves as being super helpful, but they're just wasting the vast majority of the money. So I think you and I actually agree on that.
We do, absolutely. Like I said, I think there's much the aspect of EA being a tool, the systems and how they set those systems up, I think is great. Here's a question for you. I mean, do you hear people in the EA community uh, demonstrating a deep understanding of other cultures, other values, and wanting and having reverence for them?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for other people. We can just look at the example of me, right? So if you've got a beef with people not respecting cultures enough, maybe you can point that out in myself.
Well, I think I'm more so asking, like, do you see that being demonstrated in the community? Because if you don't see that being demonstrated in the community that you're in, I would say it's probably not there. I mean, this is the default part of the Western mindset is our values are the best values, and I don't think people even realize that they're imposing them. That they don't
Well,
recognize other values as valuable. And so, if you don't see a pushback on that default, then I would say that that's probably the base level in the community, just as it is in
let's see if
most of
I'm guilty.
Western civilization. Let's see if you're guilty.
Yeah, so I donate to Give Directly, and I will admit that I haven't studied up on the culture of the people who are getting my money. I
Yeah.
just assume that it's pretty common across all cultures for people to be poor and to wish they were less poor. Not everybody. There might be some cultures who are like, ascetic culture, right? Like monk culture, who are like, we love being poor, right? But I think there's a lot of cultures where a lot of people are like, I'm poor, I'm going to work my way up, or I'm going to try to find a way to be richer. And I suspect that the people who are getting my money have enough cultural similarity on that dimension that they're like, oh, sweet, I got more money now. My life is significantly better. Thank you to Give Directly. So am I being culturally insensitive? Am I guilty here?
I mean, it depends if there's any strings attached to that money. Are people just getting money? They're just getting cash?
There's really
Um,
no strings attached. So they do study what happens with the money, and they try to see, where did we give the money where it had more impact. And they measure it like, did it revitalize the local economy? Did they like independently start having a higher GDP as a result of like, this extra liquidity in the economy, bootstrap like more. Because like when you have businesses, like when there's more demand, that enables more people to spend more time running their business, like knowing that they're going to get enough demand and they can like specialize more. So there is like very much like a snowball effect of some of these donations, and Give Directly measures it, but there are no strings attached. It's like you get the money, just we're going to try to observe what happens, but like you don't owe us anything. We can't take it back. It's your money.
so what comes up for me is I have seen multiple statements and pleas from African leaders pointing out that Western aid to Africa is keeping Africa as a continent dependent on that aid. And as many countries in Africa are unable to stand on their own 2 feet. And how is GiveWell not contributing to that? What are they doing to make sure that they're not contributing to that?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I can give you the best answer on that. Um, I mean, if we just look at the effect of like injecting $50, right, to one person, I guess you could argue like, well, now that they have $50, they could like buy foreign goods, so they're not helping the local economy. That is possible, but I think so. It's like your worry is that they're going to take demand away from the local economy because the money can be spent
No, not
overseas. They can
necessarily.
import something.
It's more like giving money. It's like giving a man a fish versus teaching him how to fish.
Right. It's just when you actually give them, I think maybe if you were to airdrop the supplies you need, like in your example of Tom's shoes, which I'm not familiar with, but it sounds plausible. Like if you airdrop too many goods, then okay, well, I was going to make the shoes locally, but now these shoes are getting airdropped, so now I can't be in business. I think that actually does make sense. And it's hard for me to know how things net out, but I definitely think there's something to that. I mean, if every possible good were imported, then I agree that would probably be bad for the local economy unless they could make it cheaper, which they probably can't. I think in practice, though, what's happening is a lot of the goods that they need are spent locally. Like when they're buying the roof they need or the food they need, I do actually think that they're stimulating the local economy.
I just think it would be much more valuable, even if that what injecting this cash is not itself detrimental or harmful. It would be much more valuable if they were buying that roof with money they made because their economy and society was better developed, right? If they
Yeah,
had more trustworthy institutions, if their society could better stand on its own feet as opposed to being dependent on foreign aid, right? And
totally.
and
Yeah,
as you keep on, if they can only afford that new roof because people are donating money to buy that roof for them, as opposed to people helping them, learn how to create a sustainable economy and a stable governance system.
mhm.
Right? Like you feel great giving that $1,000, but I think the impact is relatively small, minuscule.
So I don't think it's minuscule. I think it's, the whole point of effective altruism is they measure the impact to be like really good per dollar. I mean, if you want to talk about maybe a more intuitive example, I mean, the mosquito net example, right? It's a really cheap mosquito net and it prevents somebody from getting malaria, pretty good as a statistical average. Um, that's an example where I think it's very clear why the mosquito net today probably is a good investment compared to being like, no, no mosquito net today. We have to just focus on stimulating your economy
Agreed.
and improving your politics. It's like, well, can't we just give them the mosquito net today, right? So isn't there? Don't you want to do both?
Yes, I probably, like I mentioned, there are immediate concerns that I think are totally valid. But are people in EA also taking into account the long term vision? And I don't see that being I personally don't see that being reflected in the EA community.
I think that, well, effective altruism, they talk about cause areas. And I haven't seen this, but I can imagine somebody's written up a cause area where it's like helping governance of countries whose economies are struggling, right? And that's probably going to be a bigger impact long term than giving them $50 today or giving them a mosquito net today. And I agree. And it gets back to what we were saying about capitalism, right? If you look at a decade long timeline, getting capitalism working better for them is probably going to have more positive impact than giving them some money today or giving them some donations today. I think we agree long term, altruism is not like this long term engine that creates wealth and uplifts humanity as much as capitalism is, right? I think we agree on that. It's just there's a surplus of money today, right? And like we're all living large here and stimulating our economy, like in the United States, for example, a rich country. Like we're doing really well. We have this extra money and we face a choice between literally like, should I buy some stock? Should I buy a bigger TV or a fancier mattress for my bed? Or should I just send it to somebody who needs pretty basic goods?
Or do you put more time into building your own community?
Right, but so then it becomes the matter, like I said before, of the return on investment, right? So if it's the same $1,000, should I spend $1,000 toward like an expensive community center, or toward donations? And there's
You
nothing wrong
could
with the community center, but it's just like but in terms of like helping people,
I,
like
I actually
what's going to
don't
do more
think it's
good?
so much. I mean, it could be um, you're going to decide instead of giving that money, you're going to decide to work less, and so you have more time to be in person with your family, with your friends, with people in your community. Right? This is
Right.
not a problem that can
Well,
be solved. Right? We have a lot of problems in
yeah,
not just the wealthiest country in the world, but the wealthiest country in the history of humanity. I don't think
yeah.
money
So,
is the problem,
well,
right?
remember. I think we should. You can probably agree that we can take it as a starting assumption that some people have a charity budget, right? There's some people who feel like they have plenty of money, or let's
Mhm.
say they make a good six-figure salary, and their expenses are relatively low, and they just want to
Mhm.
take 10% of their income and donate it. Or let's say they're old, they're sitting on millions of dollars, they feel like their kids have enough money, or they don't have kids. And so there's this concept of a charity budget. I think that's the beginning of the discussion because anytime we're saying, hey, help your family, focus on yourself, like relax, don't kill yourself, don't work yourself too hard. Fine. Like when we're just talking about all these lifestyle choices, I think people should just like do what makes them feel good. It's just once they've done what makes them feel good, a lot of times they end up with a charity budget or a desire to use money to help people today. Right? Is that a good baseline assumption for the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great to earmark, some portion of your annual budget to giving. Um, I'm a strong proponent for, you know, build up your own community.
Yeah, and okay, so I think that's the starting point for the discussion is what do people do with their charity budgets? And like I said, effective altruism exists because if you go back 10 or 20 years, people were just taking that charity budget and donating it to like an animal shelter that didn't save that many animals' lives per dollar, let's say, or would donate it to what you said, like misguided charities that were actually like hurting the economies of where they're trying to donate, or even just doing initiatives that sounded really good on paper, but just turned out to not move the needle much. For example, like, oh, we're going to educate better in schools. We're going to get better textbooks for African schools. And it just turned out that the measured impact of the better textbooks was like zero, right? Like stuff like that. And so effective altruism comes on the scene and it's like, listen, redirect your charity budget from here to here. And then a bunch of people will like not have malaria, right? Like it just seems like such a simple case.
I think like the malaria, that seems, I have no issue with that, but why not? Okay, this country, San Francisco, full of lots of ineffective charities focusing on the homeless problem. Why is EA not standing up an actually effective charity? Like,
I think
Instead, EA is saying, oh, well, dollar for impact, we can have a much bigger immediate impact in other parts of the world, and they're totally neglecting their, what's happening literally on their doorstep, and what's impacting their children.
I think the reason you don't see clean up San Francisco streets as an EA cause area, I think you don't see it. I've never seen it before. I think it's just because if you have a donation budget, right? If you have $1,000 to donate, I don't think throwing money as a donation to anywhere in San Francisco is going to help that many homeless people or help that much city quality. I think that we can probably all agree it's like a matter of governance, right? So the impact would be like, so maybe you want to fund like lobbyists to go or candidates to run for election. And I think it's a valuable exercise, right? Like, I agree with you that San Francisco could use better governance. And I think it is actually trending in that direction, right? I think recently some leaders got elected who are going to be stricter a little bit on cleaning up the streets or whatever. But are you surprised that you don't see it as an EA cause area, given that it's more political than like donation based?
Yeah, I do, because as we spoke about, one of the things that I think EA has done well is it's taking these best practices from the technology industry. Well, that has been very successful for the technology industry in assessing problems and solutions for them, and in building very effective systems for that. Why are they not doing that for local problems? Why the Bay Area is probably the most EA rich place, right? Has the most per capita EA people, and yet I think in many ways it's a miserable place.
And so, what specifically?
What does that say about EA?
Asking, like, what do you expect EA to do in this situation? Like, start a charity, which is more effective than
why does it have to be a charity?
Initiative?
Why? I mean, one, there are private enterprises that are popular in the EA community. I mean, as you mentioned, capitalism can be a useful vehicle. Why not politics? I mean, why is EA so focused on internationally focused charities?
I mean, I think that's just what we talk about when we talk about effective altruism. Like, we start from the assumption of people have a donation budget, and then they just have to decide among existing organizations where to send the budget. And now you're basically saying, why decide among existing organizations? Why not start your own organization if you're part of the EA community and have that organization be really effective?
Well, some of these charities that are focusing on Africa are, stood up by people in the EA community, right? Like, they noticed the charities focusing on Africa, they're very inefficient, across the board. So they stood up their own charities focusing on Africa. How come they didn't? We have the same problem here in the U.S. Why are they not focusing on the U.S.?
I think that's reasonable. Like, when we talk about an EA cause area, we're not just talking about donating your money to an existing organization. We're also talking about, hey, if you want to just take initiative to make an effort in this area, you should, right? So that is part of being an EA cause area. So I think the question just becomes, okay, well, is spending effort to try to improve San Francisco, is that going to be in the same ballpark of helping people as spending efforts to try to help in like really poor regions? And I think the general conclusion you get from EA is like, look, improving San Francisco is great, but you're just going to get 10 to 100 times more bang for your buck or for your effort if you go and take that same initiative and apply it to, I don't know, Senegal.
And ultimately, I disagree with that assessment. I mean, I think that the United States right now, culturally, fiscally, politically, is in a very bad state. And I think that this country really should focus on getting itself into a healthy place before it can start
but is San
helping
Francisco
other people.
In a bad state compared to Senegal?
I'm not super familiar with Senegal, but I'll give you an example here. Mexican. I mean, I was in Mexico. I spent 5 weeks in Mexico. I'm Latino. I'm very familiar with Latin America. I've spent, I don't know, a 12th of my life in Latin America. People in general in Latin America are much happier than Americans. They have much healthier social connections than Americans. You look at Israelis. Every generation of Israelis knows war, something that Americans don't know. But they are happier and healthier, in my assessment, because they have much stronger social connections. The social fabric of the country is much healthier. The same is true in Latin America. And I think that has a detrimental impact on the United States. But our social fabric is extremely frayed.
So
Um,
is your argument here that countries like Senegal that have like a $1,000 GDP per capita, maybe they're actually less worthy of altruism than countries like the US that seem rich?
it's so that there's kind of there's two issues I'm taking here. One, I think ultimately as a country we can help humanity as a whole if we are healthy, which we're not right now. And then two, um, I would want my children to grow up in a healthy society. I value the lives of my children. Well, I don't have, but values. I value the well-being of people I have close connections with more than the people on the other side of the world. And I think that's fine. I think that's very human. So the disagreement I have with EA is this notion that you're supposed to value everybody regardless of your social connection to them. I don't think
Okay.
that's. I disagree with that.
All right, fair enough.
One question I have is how healthy is the EA community itself? I don't get the sense when I meet people in the EA community and I go to EA events. To me, they don't feel good. To me, they don't feel like wholesome places. Culturally, socially.
Okay, how so?
Um, I mean, one, they seem hyper rational, in a way where there's a lack of, I think, emotional attunement oftentimes. Um,
Okay, well, I think I'm guilty of being hyper rational, so and even having a low emotional attunement. So, but like, I think I'm an aspie, right? So what am I supposed to do?
it's a good question. I Look, I don't know how you like experience the world and how you might be hardwired differently, but um, I would be very skeptical of the claim that you couldn't be more emotionally attuned. And I think understanding other cultures, if you want to go have impact on people, other parts of the world and other cultures with other values, I think emotional attunement is really important.
So let's say I became really emotionally attuned like you. Then as a result, where would I donate my charity budget?
Uh, to people suffering that when you walk on the street, and
Okay,
maybe
so
and maybe
just be like,
maybe it's
sorry, give
not.
directly. I need this wad
Oh,
of 20s to carry on. So whenever I see a homeless guy, I gotta give him the 20, and that's my charity.
well, but like how often are you buying food for somebody, a homeless person, or how often are
Okay,
you?
but in San Francisco, right? You're all about improving San Francisco. Do you think the best way to improve San Francisco is by giving the homeless people
No,
20s?
no, I don't. But maybe it would be being more involved in local politics, right? Maybe it would
Okay,
be.
but does that help me spend my charity budget?
Maybe you spend your charity budget in a way where you have more time. So you're spending it on yourself, so you have more time, right? Okay, money is not the thing that San Francisco needs. San Francisco has an abundance of money, but they need, smart, thoughtful people to be more involved.
Okay. And I actually live in San Jose, so but we are having a little bit of a homeless problem here too. So like, you're basically saying, hey, carve out some time every week to go lobby the city or like run for office to try to clean up San Jose a little bit. I mean, I don't think San Jose is terrible, but like, if I do all that, does that mean I should like not donate my charity budget to give directly?
I wouldn't say to not necessarily do that, but if you have to make a choice, I would say, in general, prioritize solving local problems. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, have you ever seen a particular
Starting,
local organization that's effective with donations that you recommend?
no, and like I said, I would focus on more your time more so, but it could also be, you have uh, like I think you could have a much bigger impact by mentoring somebody. Take a young adult, smart person, uh, disadvantaged in some way. Mentoring them, I think you'd have a bigger impact on the world than sending $1,000 to Africa.
But what should I do with $1,000?
Maybe you sponsor them to, I could point them to a great, a workshop that would help them a lot.
Okay. Last question for you. Think about the billionaires. Dustin Moskovitz is probably the most famous EA billionaire, and he has his own organization called Good Ventures, and he's the primary funder of open philanthropy. So he has like $1 billion that he needs to allocate. Okay. And I know you've given advice of like, hey, you should mentor somebody locally and improve their life, but he has $1 billion. Okay. So what should Dustin be doing with his $1 billion?
Focusing on the United States.
Okay. So
if I had $1 billion of philanthropy, I would be focusing on the United States.
Okay. And then like, what are some specific places where you could spend that money?
That's a good question. Something I might do with that is come up with a repeatable model, a model that could be invested in by municipal, state, federal policy, and prove out that model in a way that improves the social fabric, the health, some important aspect of our well-being in American communities, and prove out a model that politicians at different levels could materially support.
Okay. Now, if there's some initiative, I feel like these kind of things do exist. A specific name doesn't come to mind, but let's say, hey, school children, they're all failing on this part of their education, or like there's like a big segment of school children that never learn to read well enough when they graduate. Hypothetically, if there's some initiative like that, and they made a pitch like, hey, we've calculated that every time you just donate $50 to this, you make a child a better reader, and that increases their future career earnings by like $50,000. So it's like a high return on investment in that sense. If you heard a pitch like that, would you be like, oh, wow, this sounds pretty good. This sounds like Dustin Moskovitz should spend some of his $1 billion to fund that.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
Okay, so that methodology that we just used, though, like you hear a pitch like that, you say that pitch sounds good. Aren't we doing effective altruism when we do that methodology?
Yeah, maybe. Like I said, I think the tools that the effective altruism has developed, I think there's a lot of positive and a lot of potential there. But the question that is, how come effective altruists are hyper focused on problems on the other side of the planet?
Yeah, so and I think the answer is just it's a really good deal, right? So it's like, let's say you just wanted to be nice and buy somebody a drink. This is actually an analogy from Will McCaskill's book, Doing Good Better. If you just want to buy a round of drinks, well, if the round of drinks costs like $1,000 to treat everybody, then maybe you're not going to be buying that many rounds of drinks. But if all the drinks cost a penny, you might be like, okay, guys, this one's on me. And that's how donors feel about Senegal and all of these low GDP places. It's like, hey, guys, I am going to make your world so much better using like a tiny cost, right? So that's what's appealing about it.
I understand what's appealing about it. I'm not saying don't do any of that, but it feels out of balance to me. But if the EA community is 80% focused on the rest of the world right now, and 20% focused on local issues, that should probably be flipped. And I think you'd actually have a much bigger impact if you, I think most people are going to agree this country needs better leaders. So if you invested in developing those leaders from a relatively young age, our early, mid, late 20s, early 30s, and also teaching them, helping them develop the ability to understand other cultures so that they can direct American policy in a way that is more beneficial to other countries. I think that would have a much bigger impact. And that impact is not necessarily that far out. That impact could be 5, 10, 20 years, and it would dwarf, your $1,000 going to Africa.
Cool. All right, I will give a recap of the debate, and then you can give your closing statement. You can have the last word. So, as I've said on the show, I'm an effective altruist. I think they've done a lot of good for the world. I think there is a charity budget, like $1 trillion a year charity budget that people have. They want to donate. People actually are altruistic when they have the bandwidth to be, when they're not currently suffering or starving. They do tend to be altruistic. I am a little bit myself. And effective altruism has done a lot of good for the world, advising people on where to send these charity budgets. So instead of sending it to something that's only going to do a little bit of good, you can send it somewhere that's going to do literally 100 times more good. And that seems really great. That seems really exciting. It seems like we've racked up quite a lot of success stories. And not only that, but the people in EA, while they tend to be hyper-rational like myself, I actually think that the people tend to be pretty caring and thoughtful, good people. So I disagree with the characterization that like the people are like secretly evil or selfish or don't really care about who they want to help. I think they generally are good people, as good as you'll find in pretty much any charitable movement. And if you read Scott Alexander, I'll put up a link in the show notes. He has a very good post where he attended Effective Altruism Global, and he has some heartwarming stories about like how thoughtful and caring the people that he talked to were. They weren't just all hyper-rational aspies like me. So yeah, I'm very positive on effective altruism. We managed to get through the conversation with neither of us mentioning Sam Bankman-Fried, but I actually think that's fine. I don't think Sam Bankman-Fried is like the epitome of effective altruism. I think he's just a random asshole, and I'm perfectly fine not talking about him. So yeah, and I think at the end of the day, if you want to dismiss effective altruism, you end up just reinventing it when you are actually doing the most basic analysis of whether your money's helping. You end up reinventing effective altruism. And so if the movement died, there's no doubt in my mind it would just get rediscovered because it's so freaking obvious that it's kind of a joke to do anything else. And frankly, I think that in this conversation, we kind of reinvented it. All right, so everybody go read Will McCaskill's book, Doing Good Better, which I thought was a really great book. Actually, probably one of the top 10 books I've ever read. It was just a really good, solid book. And that's what got me started donating to give directly, because I'm like, well, this makes sense. And Will McCaskill also has a newer book out, which I haven't read, but I recommend reading his first book, because it's going to be hard to top. All right, you get the last word.
Sure. So I'll first, I want to say I don't think that effective altruists are secretly evil, or not caring or not thoughtful. But I do notice that effective altruists are much more focused on solving problems in other parts of the world. I don't think that's a mistake. I think that is related to their fundamental, foundational part of their worldview. And I think it is a mistake to be that focused on problems around the world when one's own community and one's own country is on life support and is deeply unwell. I think we can have a much bigger impact on those people around us, and I support valuing those relationships more. And I think that we can have a bigger impact on humanity by rebuilding and building even a healthier society than this country has seen so far.
Jonas, thanks so much for coming into the Lion's Den and putting up the anti-effective altruism position. Everybody follow Jonas on Instagram. His username's @Jonas_wanders. If anybody else is anti-effective altruism and thinks they have stronger arguments than Jonas, email me, wiseguy@gmail.com. I'm happy to do another debate. Let's defend effective altruism. I think people are getting so riled up about a concept that is like so obviously good and has done a bunch of good and will continue to do good. All right, Jonas, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thanks. My pleasure to be here.
Thanks again to Jonas for engaging in good faith debate. That's what we do here on Doom Debates. Couple announcements before you go. First, there's an international Pause AI protest going down February 7th to 11th. If you go to pauseai.info, there's a bar at the top linking you to the protest page, and you can see details of different cities around the world, and you can join the protests. And the timing of the protest is because of the Paris AI Action Summit. We want to make AI safety the focus of the Paris AI Action Summit by showing this grassroots movement that it's time to pause AI because it's getting too dangerous and crazy. I've been seeing some crazy back and forths on Twitter on the subject of how crazy AI is getting and the need to pause. And you can look forward to me covering those in an upcoming episode of Twitter Beefs, the sub-series of Doom Debates that's just called Twitter Beefs. So that's coming soon. Last announcement, I'm doing a live Q&A next Friday, January 24th at noon to 1:30 p.m. Pacific. It's going to be on YouTube Live. There's a link in the show notes. If you want to ask a question, then come join live, get in that chat room. We'll be talking in real time. Or go to my Substack. You'll see a post about the YouTube Live. And you can comment on Substack if you want to asynchronously ask a question. And I'm going to prioritize all of my Substack subscribers. Because right now I have more YouTube subscribers than Substack subscribers. Why would you just subscribe on YouTube and not on Substack? Go to Substack, become a Substack subscriber too. You get priority in these Q&As. You get bonus content. I know your email address so that we can keep in touch better in case the YouTube algorithm screws me. And by the way, we're celebrating 2,500 YouTube subscribers. The journey to 1 million subscribers, as the proverb says, begins with 2,500 subscribers. So thank you for being part of this journey. Still pretty early. And by the end of this year, I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to make a real impact in the discourse just by having a ton of subscribers, having a large audience, especially, people who matter, people who care about good arguments in AI. That's you guys. So thanks again. And I'll see you back here on the next episode of Doom Debates.